The Republic is a book about the regime, and all later political philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And that means that it must provide a series of variations, so to speak, on Plato's conception of the best regime. But what is a regime? Broadly speaking, the regime indicates a form of government, whether it is ruled by the one, the few, the many, or, is more common, some mixture or combination of these three ruling powers. The regime is defined in the first instance by how people are governed and how public offices are distributed, by election, by birth, by lot, by outstanding personal qualities and achievements, and what constitutes a people's rights and responsibilities. The regime, again, refers above all to a form of government. The political world does not present itself as simply an infinite variety of different shapes. It is structured and ordered into a few basic regime types. And this, I take it to be one of the most important propositions and insights of political science. Right? So far? But there is a corollary to this insight. The regime is always something particular. It stands in a relation of opposition to other regime types. And as a consequence, the possibility of conflict, of tension, and war is built into the very structure of politics. Regimes are necessarily partisan. That is to say, they install certain loyalties and passions in the same way that one may feel partisanship to the New York Yankees or the Boston Red Sox or to Yale over all rival colleges and institutions, right? Fierce loyalty, partisanship. It's inseparable from the character of regime politics. These passionate attachments are not merely something that take place, you might say, between different regimes, but even within them, as different parties and groups with loyalties and attachments contend for power, for honor, and for interest. Henry Adams once cynically reflected that politics is simply the organization of hatreds. And there is more than a grain of truth to this, right? Although he did not say that it is also an attempt to channel and redirect those hatreds and animosities towards something like a common good. This raises a question. Is it possible to transform politics, to replace enmity and factional conflict with friendship, to replace conflict with harmony? Today it is the hope of many people, both here and abroad, that we might even overcome, might even transcend the basic structure of regime politics altogether and organize our world around global norms of justice and international law. Is such a thing possible? It can't be ruled out, but such a world, I would note, that is to say, a world administered by international courts of law, by judges and judicial tribunals, would no longer be a political world. Politics only takes place within the context of the particular. It is only possible within the structure of the regime itself. But a regime is more than simply a set of formal structures and institutions, okay? It consists of the entire way of life, the moral and religious practices, the habits, customs, and sentiments that make a people what they are. The regime constitutes an ethos, that is to say, a distinctive character that nurtures distinctive human types. Every regime shapes a common character type with distinctive traits and qualities. So the study of regime politics is in part a study of the distinctive national character types that constitutes a citizen body. To take an example of what I mean, when Tocqueville studied the American regime, or the democratic regime, properly speaking, in Democracy in America, he started first with our formal political institutions as enumerated in the Constitution, such things as the separation of powers, the division between state and federal government, and so on, but then went on to look at such informal practices as American manners and morals, our tendency to form small civic associations, our peculiar moralism and religious life, our defensiveness about democracy, and so on. All of these intellectual and moral customs and habits help to constitute the democratic regime. In this regime, in this sense, the regime describes the character or tone of a society, what a society finds most praiseworthy, what it looks up to. Okay? You can't understand a regime unless you understand, so to speak, what it stands for, what a people stand for, what they look up to, as well as its structure of institutions and rights and privileges. This raises a further set of questions that we will consider over the term. How are regimes founded? The founding of regimes. What brings them into being and sustains them over time? For thinkers like Tocqueville, for example, regimes are embedded in the deep structures of human history that have determined over long centuries the shape of our political institutions and the way we think about them. Yet other voices within the tradition, Plato, Machiavelli, Rousseau come to mind, believe that regimes can be self-consciously founded through deliberate acts of great statesmen, or founding fathers, as we might call them. These statesmen, Machiavelli, for example, refers to Romulus, Moses, Cyrus as the founders that he looks to. We might think of men like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and the like, are shapers of peoples and institutions. The very first of the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton even begins by posing this question in the starkest terms. It has been frequently remarked, Hamilton writes, that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. There we see Hamilton asking the basic question about the founding of political institutions. Are they created, as he puts it, by reflection and choice, that is to say, by a deliberate act of statecraft and conscious human intelligence, or are regimes always the product of accident, circumstance, custom, and history? But the idea that regimes may be created or founded by a set of deliberate acts raises a further question that we will study and is inseparable from the study of regimes. N'est-ce pas? Who is a statesman? What is a statesman? Again, one of the oldest questions of political science, very rarely asked by the political science of today, that is very skeptical of the language of statesmanship. In its oldest sense, political science simply was a science of statecraft. It was addressed to statesmen or potential statesmen charged with steering the ship of state. What are the qualities necessary for sound statesmanship? How does statecraft differ from other kinds of activities? Must the good statesman, as Plato believed, for example, be a philosopher? versed in poetry, mathematics, and metaphysics? Or is statesmanship, as Aristotle believed, a purely practical skill requiring judgment based on deliberation and experience? Is a streak of cruelty and a willingness to act immorally necessary for statecraft, as Machiavelli infamously argued? Must the statesman be capable of literally transforming human nature, as Rousseau maintains? Or is the sovereign a more or less faceless bureaucrat in the manner of a modern, say, a modern CEO, as, for example, someone like Hobbes seems to have believed? All of our texts that we will read, the Republic, the Politics, the Prince, the Social Contract, have different views on the qualities of statecraft and those qualities necessary to found and maintain states that we will be considering. All of this, in a way, is another way of saying, or at least implying, okay, that political philosophy is an eminently practical discipline, a practical field. Its purpose is not simply contemplation. Its purpose is not reflection alone. It is advice-giving. None of the people we will study this semester were cloistered scholars detached from the world, although this is a very common prejudice against political philosophy, that it is somehow uniquely sort of pie in the sky and detached from the world. But the great thinkers were very far from being just, so to speak, detached intellectuals. Plato undertook 3 long and dangerous voyages to Sicily in order to advise the king Dionysius. Aristotle famously was a tutor of Alexander the Great. Machiavelli spent a large part of his career in the foreign service of his native Florence and wrote as an advisor to the Medici. Hobbes was the tutor to a royal household who followed the king into exile during the English Civil War. And Locke was associated with the Shaftesbury Circle, who also was forced into exile after being accused of plotting against the English king. Rousseau had no official political connections, but he signed his name always, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citizen of Geneva, and was approached to write constitutions for Poland and for the island of Corsica. And Tocqueville was a member of the French National Assembly, whose experience of American democracy deeply affected the way he saw the future of Europe. So the great political thinkers were typically engaged in the politics of their times and help in that way to provide us, okay, with models for how we might think about ours. Take a little break for refreshment. But this goes in a slightly different direction as well. Not only is this study of the regime, as we've seen,